This is another of the apples which I highly regard and which I encourage people to consider planting. This is Winston, otherwise known as Winter King. I've mentioned this fruit before. It's a little broken branch there, carrying a heavy crop. This apple was originally named Winter King. It was renamed Winston in honour of Sir Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister during most of the Hitler War. A man about whom there was a lot of controversy, but he is generally thought of as a great national hero. Anyhow, the apple was named in his honour, and without implying any disrespect for the great man, this in fact is an apple we prefer to call Winter King. It has a couple of faults, one of which is that it always sets too many fruit, so you have to thin it by hand. And you probably notice that the average size of these apples is not very large. I thinned it, but I didn't take the drought into account enough. I probably should have thinned it again. And here we have quite small apples. And this will typically set 4, 5, 6 or even 7 apples to a cluster. You get a cluster of 7 apples. I mean, here you can see I'm growing a great big thick cluster here. If you've got 7 apples, you should really thin that to 2, probably. 3 is another cluster. Having said that, the other side of that fault, if you want to call it a fault shared by a number of other good apples, including Sunset and Spartan, is that it always produces an absolute storm of blossom, and it's very self-fertile. Some trees are like, for example, Ribston Pippin, I've recently posted another video about. It's a great apple, but it's a triploid, and it's not always so easy to pollinate. You really do need to think carefully about pollen partners for a difficult apple to pollinate like Ribston Pippin. But this one is not a problem. It will pollinate other apples. It's a seedling of Cox's Orange Pippin and something else. It's got a very good flavour. One of the really good positives about Winter King stroke Winston is that it's a very long keeping apple. It's very crisp texture which people love. This is one of the first 5 of these particular trees I planted, and to be quite honest, this is the best of them. This one next to it, don't ask me why. This tree received the same treatment. It was planted the same day. It's identical in every way, and so was this one, but they just haven't done as well, and that's because this is very sandy soil here, isn't it, Julia?
Yeah, sandy and stony, very free draining.
Yeah, well, that means it doesn't become squelchy mud like London clay soil might do. It's quite free draining. However, in a drought year, the trees just do struggle to survive. And the soil around here is very variable. We're going to be adding a huge amount of dung to these trees. Well, we've changed our plans, but the trees are now further apart. We've taken some trees out and replanted. But you know, this is what a tree can do. This is what it should be looking like. There's a very good weight of fruit on this. We planted 5 originally based on the descriptions of the tree that I had read in apple books. We ordered it as Winston. We got these as with all of our original stock from Blackmore Nurseries, who I highly recommend. Although, you know, always shop around and think about supporting your local nursery if you have one. If I lived in Kent, I would certainly be looking at Keeper's Nursery. In Somerset and Devon, there's some Ashridge trees. They're very good as well. But you know, we tend to recommend Blackmore. I'm sorry, I'm going off the subject again. It's another tree. You can see these are a little bit thin, aren't they? A little bit small. They should have been thinned more aggressively. But we planted some of these, and as soon as we took them to the market, people had a taste of, oh, I like that, I'll have some of that. And they were very, very popular. And in the end, in the final stage, this is the first part of the orchard, this is the first section of the orchard that we planted in 1992-93 winter. We've made many changes to it since. But the final orchard we planted, which we planted in 99-2000, which is sort of way over there, we call this section Bunyards. That newest section we call Cobbets, both named after famous men. And I mean, Bunyard, well, I won't diverge too much about that, but I planted a row of 33 rootstocks, and I grafted every one of them in situ with this variety. Winter King, and they all grew very well, and they're the mainstay of our crop. These are our older trees. But this is an attractive apple. If you don't thin it aggressively, it will be small, but if you do thin it decently, you know, it certainly will achieve a very acceptable size. It's a long-keeping apple. Really crisp, sharp. The texture is a bit like Granny Smith, but it's got a much better flavour than old Granny. Long keeping apple, certainly one of my top 20 apples. There are fruits which have a better flavour, but this is a long keeper and it's very reliable. It used to be widely grown. The industry obviously is not interested in an apple that requires to be thinned by hand, because that implies labour. That means you have to have human beings and pay them a wage, and they're always trying to screw the price down. The supermarkets are always trying to screw the price further down. They want a uniform, predictable apple that can be handled as much as possible by machine. Winston doesn't fit them, Winston / Winter King, but it's a great backyard apple, and one that I'd sincerely recommend people consider. You don't want this to be your only apple. If you're only planting one apple tree in your garden, it probably should not be Winston, although that's up to you as long as you know what you're doing, because you want an early apple, and if you've only got one apple, you probably want a mid-season one like Lord Lambourne or Egremont Russet. You don't want a very early one, you don't want a very late one. But if you're planting 3 or more apple trees in your backyard orchard, and I would hope that you're able to, and if you can, you should. Well, I'll rephrase that. If you can, I'd encourage you to. Then you want one of them to be a long keeper. You don't want only one. If you've only got one apple, you don't want it to be a long keeper, because then you'll get frustrated waiting for it to be ripe, and you'll try to eat it before it's really ripe, and that's disappointing. If you've only got one apple and it's an early, then your apples will be finished by the middle of September, and that's going to be disappointing. So a mid-season with a reasonable season, like Sunset, Egremont Russet, Lord Lambourne, Kids Orange Red, would be decent choices. This is a good choice for one of 5. If you're planting sort of 3 to 5 apples in your garden, you want one of them to be a long keeper. Sorry, I think I've made that point enough. Okay then, well I better shut up and do some work.